Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait a few moments to make sure everyone is here before we begin. Hi, everyone. We're going to begin the webinar shortly. I'm just going to wait for the participants to join us. Wait another minute or so. Okay. Well, I think we'll begin now. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope, and you're all very welcome to this webinar, Feeding the Future Shared Responsibility, which is hosted by the National Women's Council and Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland to mark National Breastfeeding Week. My name is Aoibhinn Ní Shúilleabháin, and I'm delighted to be moderating this webinar today, as this is an issue that I'm passionate about. We have a wonderful lineup for you in the next hour and a half, and I hope that the keynote, the contributions and the panel discussions will provide plenty of food for thought for everyone in how we can better share the responsibility of feeding our babies. I want to say from the outset that the conversation today is aiming to highlight and share knowledge around infant feeding, and that it is absolutely the choice of every family how they wish to feed their baby. The discussion will review the systems, the culture and the environment in which we make the decision on how to feed our babies, and ask how we can improve the supports through policy, funding and societal practices for all families to have relevant and timely information on feeding their baby. There's no judgment, merely information to empower and not prescribe any choice. Now, after our keynote from President Michael D. Higgins and Sabina Higgins, we will hear from Deborah Byrne from Bainne Beatha, and we'll then have our panel discussion with Laura McHugh, Professor Gerard Hastings, Dr. Meredith Kenosha, Orla O'Connor and Dr. Liz O'Sullivan. We're going to be taking questions through the Q&A box, so please do take part, because I know there's great interest in this panel discussion today, and I'm sure that there will be many, many contributions from all of you that are joining us for the afternoon. Now, it is my absolute sincere pleasure to introduce our keynote speakers for today's webinar, and we are incredibly delighted that they were able to join us for our discussion today. Please welcome President Michael D. Higgins and Mrs. Sabina Higgins.
Reflecting on the stress laid on integrated thinking in relation to food at the recent summit of the United Nations, the importance of food, its provision, its storage, its distribution, nutrition and stunting, I was struck by how exceptional the contribution from the spokesperson for El Salvador was. Her emphasis on the importance of breastfeeding stood out as exceptional in its appearing to be the statement of something obvious, basic and convincing, yet it was so different to the more quantitative speeches. I have since then given much further thought to that session at the United Nations at which I spoke. Yes, on reflection, perhaps that speech could be regarded as maybe among the most important, most obvious contribution of all. All of us who participated at any level in the session should ask, what is it that is stopping governments and policymakers from seeing that recovering and promoting breastfeeding could make one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest contribution to children's health, nutrition, development? Why can governments not see that beyond the direct benefit to the health of children and mothers, which is the most important aspect, there is the possibility of avoiding the spending of billions on later health issues that could have been avoided had breastfeeding been recognised as a sustainable approach, as a right, and as a promoted health policy. I believe that breastfeeding should be a central part of the food strategy discussion at global level. The Salvadorian speaker at the session of the United Nations, as part of the food security statement, had chosen her topic well. Why did it sound exceptional? The truth is that there is a reluctance in assumed conditions of modernity to engage with those factors in history that, as a part of the dominating practices of colonization and its suggested civilization, as representing a universal system, breastfeeding was seen as perhaps the practice of backward people. Then too, perhaps presenting its replacement as modernity was easier, as the commodification of child feeding was getting underway. There is, however, in the contemporary period, much more at work beyond such bogus modernization arguments. There is the fact that some largely unaccountable corporations with vast resources of finance for lobbying and abuse of advertising are active in defending what they see as a significant and growing market, one that they see as limitless. Unable to demolish the science and research that shows that breastfeed is best, they seek to confuse with advertisements that speak of follow-on products that are in reality contradictory to what breastfeeding principles envisage or stand for. The background as to what is the cultural setting too is often challenging for those who wish to breastfeed. There too, there are cultures that have been twisted into seeing a mother breastfeeding her baby as not only a breach of social norms, but as also presenting backward or dated practices in some way, discomforting to others. Such ill-informed cultural attitudes are favourable for an atmosphere then of promoting heavily marketed and perhaps even damaging products that are suggested as an inevitable part of modern living child rearing. Such capitulation in policy terms often includes a reluctance to regulate or challenge what follows, false, damaging, misleading advertisements. All of this is an indication of how powerful global corporations are, those who are responsible for such breaches. There are thus many aspects of society in conditions of commodification that combine ones of neglected historical analysis on colonization, all of the abuses associated with economic greed, issues of institutional compliance that has resulted in failure to act, issues of tacit collusion, all of which stand behind that exceptionalism to which I refer. Of my feeling breastfeeding being neglected as a topic, considered appropriate for discussion at even a summit of the United Nations on food. For all of these reasons and many, many more, I want now to offer my fullest support to all those who are organising National Breastfeeding Week 2021. I so admire the grit and courage of those who have sought to draw public attention to what we are missing with our own very low national figures in comparative terms. Restoring, respecting, encouraging, privileging breastfeeding belongs as a topic in national and international policy, in our development and poverty elimination policies, and in our health strategies. It is a basic component of sustainability. It makes sense, even in the economics of public health. I believe that we must act, examine at national and international level how we are enforcing our advertising standards, controls, how we are dealing with institutional practices, what information we are circulating, and how we are to best confront and undo the repressions that see the most natural practice in the world as discomforting or upsetting or inconvenient. encouraging parents, public decision makers, giving information supporting the practice in every way, speaking of the benefits of breastfeeding, deserves the support of us all. I send my best wishes to all involved. May you be overwhelmed with the support you will receive, and may your efforts be without borders. Verbanach.
Yeah. Yeah, the microphone is off. There you go.
I start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to be with you all this afternoon, and I wish you a happy Breastfeeding Week. National Breastfeeding Week has become a most important date in Ireland's calendar, a time when we reflect on the importance of breastfeeding for the health of our citizens and of the many benefits of breastfeeding, and on the figures around uptake of breastfeeding, which here in Ireland remain worryingly low. Even though 63.8% of women here introduce breastfeeding at their baby's first feed, just 37% of mothers are still breastfeeding at the time they leave hospital. These stark figures show we are a society which has failed to encourage, support, and normalize breastfeeding, despite clear and constantly growing evidence that this is the very best thing a mother can do for the health and development of her cherished child. Inconvenience has been cited as one of the greatest deterrents to mothers considering the question of breastfeeding. It's difficult to believe, however, that so many devoted parents who would do anything and everything for their child would reject a method of feeding that has been recommended by experts around the world as the very best source of nutrition and hydration for the babies, that they would reject it on the grounds that it is less convenient for them than bottle feeding. I firmly believe, as I know so many of you here today do, that if we delve behind that word inconvenient, we will find other words such as lack of information, lack of knowledge, embarrassment, disapproval, lack of facilities, lack of support. Many women still feel unable to breastfeed in restaurants, shopping centres, parks, and cafes. And women are forced to go into drafty hallways, public toilets, and cramped cubicles in order to breastfeed their babies, as we are not a society which prioritizes the health and welfare of its youngest citizens. Many new mothers have few or no role models amongst their peers to encourage them to breastfeed, and they often encounter disapproval and disencouragement from older members of their families and communities, as we are not a society which empowers women to make informed choices around the best way to feed and nurture their babies. A society where breastfeeding mothers who need or wish to return to the workplace feel unable to continue to breastfeed their child, despite legislation enabling them to do so, is not a society which offers women real choice in how they wish to live their lives and care for their babies. Yet these situations are so often the reality behind that simple word, inconvenient. Another reality, of course, is the sustained marketing campaign aimed at promoting formula feeding. We see it constantly, even in our television screens, while we don't see the HSE or our public broadcasting promoting breastfeeding or showing breastfeeding mothers and babies on our screen. At this point, may I say how delighted I am that our co-hosts today, along with the National Women's Council of Ireland, our Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland, who earlier this year launched a social media campaign that explored the issues of protecting infant feeding from industry influence. It is critical that we create an environment where healthy development of our children is not endangered by the economic goals of large international industries, or by cynical and aggressive advertising that promotes and has promotions aimed at new mothers and peddling nutritionally inaccurate information. The normalization of formula feeding has had far-reaching and in poorer countries across the world, disastrous consequences, including increases in mortality, malnutrition, and diarrhea in very young infants. As concerned global citizens, we must fight to ensure that breastfeeding is once more established and understood, not only as a health option for our children, but as the most effective way of preventing child mortality across the world. If we are to achieve this in the short term and in the future, we must take action. But what I sometimes think is that if all these great organizations who are dedicated to making breastfeeding the norm could come together to have a conference with the aim of deciding on a national plan of campaign, it could be very successful. Organizations like the HSE, the midwives, Lalash League, Quidju, Friends of Breastfeeding, Bainne Beatha, Pavi Point Mothers, Breastfest, of course, and of course, Baby Feeding Law Group. We really have to set our sights at breastfeeding numbers being in the 80 and 90% range, like in Sweden and other Scandinavian countries. This would be a very many-pronged program of action. Bainne Beatha, in its survey, found that mothers in hospital could not get the help they needed to get breastfeeding established, as there were not enough midwives, and also that they were too busy and overworked to give sufficient time and attention to help the mothers. Preparation for breastfeeding should begin with the first visit by a pregnant woman to her GP. She, he, the doctor, the obstetrician, the midwife, the nurse, must have the knowledge and training to help with breastfeeding. They should have the duty of encouraging mothers to breastfeed by informing them of the benefit to the baby and themselves. The antenatal preparation for birth should help the mother in preparing the breasts for feeding and give advice on latching on and what to expect and how to deal with any problems that might arise along the journey. Things like knowing if there's a blocked milk duct, that it can be treated by massaging the duct from the source, from under the armpit to the nipple, to smooth away the blockage and restore the flow. The task of normalizing breastfeeding is big and very important. Many people, small children, bigger children, adolescents, and adults, have not had the experience of seeing babies being breastfed. For tens of thousands of years, through all the generations of our ancestors, human beings survived and thrived by being breastfed. My mother, and mostly all the mothers of the country at that time, breastfed. We were 7 children, and we and all the children at our school were 2 and 2.5 years apart. So it seems babies were breastfed exclusively for a year, and that acted as a contraceptive for spacing the family. Then during the 40s, all that was tragically lost. People and medical people were persuaded by the advertising lie that formula bottle feed was best. I remember the Cow and Gate ads. 30 years later, when I came to breastfeed my children, almost all babies were bottle fed. Antenatal personnel never mentioned breastfeeding, and doctors and nurses in the hospital knew nothing about breastfeeding and could give no help to the new mothers wanting to breastfeed. Fortunately, we were able to get information from a book on breastfeeding and a member of Lalash League. Things have improved, but there is much room for improvement. There must be enough midwives in the health service for them to have a relationship with the expectant mother right through her journey and to be available to her right through birth and latching on. She must be available until breastfeeding is successfully established, both in the hospital and afterwards at home. Now, thanks to the great scientific research done by the United Nations great World Health Organization, it has been proven beyond any doubt that human breast milk is the very best start in life that can be given to a baby, and that nothing else compares with it. It provides baby with all the nutrients it needs for healthy growth at the right pace and at the right weight, and it protects it from becoming obese later in life. It recommends that a baby is fed exclusively on breast milk for the first 6 months, and then it can go straight on to solids and continue breast milk or other milk as the mother wishes. Now, this has brought change for the better. Midwives are now back, and nurses are trained as midwives that can help mothers with breastfeeding. There is so much work to be done to make breastfeeding a normalized experience in society in general. As I've said, there are so few role models that many people have never seen a baby being breastfed. Even babies who have been breastfed may not remember. And for them and everyone, it is necessary that they are helped to be familiar with this experience. This could be provided at all stages of education, right from their first years in school and on through every stage. There can be age-appropriate storybooks and health educational books and videos available at all stages of the curriculum. I think that the Belfast Big Community Festival, Breastfest, is such a great experience for the whole community. Maybe it could be replicated down here. Seeing the joy of mothers gather together for latching on mornings and their pleasure in exchanging stories and then their wish to help other mothers with breastfeeding is such a reason for optimism. I have no doubt but that breastfeeding mothers in a school would be happy to come to a schoolroom for a health education class to allow children to see a baby being breastfed. Seeing a baby being breastfed would seem to be a lovely, natural, and even essential experience for a person growing up conscious of the wonder of human life. I think there are great people in the health service who are supportive of breastfeeding, and that it needs a coming together of all organizations to maybe go in deputation to the Minister for Health, the Department of Health, and the HSE, and to lobby at Leinster House, in the Dáil, and in the Senate, remember, so daughter is that, and indeed the teachers' unions. It will be necessary for the government in its budget to provide the necessary resources to ensure that there are enough midwives in the hospital and in the community with the motivation and the objective of bringing back breastfeeding. May I conclude, therefore, by thanking all those who have participated in today's seminar. Your commitment to the empowerment of women to make informed decisions around how they wish to feed their children is so welcome and commendable. I hope it will be a most productive and enjoyable seminar, and that there will continue to be great success with this important work. So lots of love and happy Breastfeeding Week.
Thank you sincerely, Sabina Higgins. We're so thrilled with that address, and I think you have given us all a drive to bring back breastfeeding. But I think what you've addressed there is the complexity of the issue. I mean, it's not just the responsibility of any one family, but certainly not of the midwives either. It's a larger systemic issue. And yes, I think lobbying in the Dáil and the Seanad, working with the Department of Health, the Department of Education, and Department of Communication, Justice, all of these things will all contribute to this really important discussion and this really important work. So thank you sincerely again to President Michael D. Higgins and Sabine, champions of breastfeeding, for addressing our webinar this National Breastfeeding Week. Now, while today isn't about any one mother's story, it is important to set the context of the conversation by listening to the experience of a mother. And I'm delighted to welcome Deborah Byrne, who is a breastfeeding mother and also founder of Bainne Beatha, a campaign for improved breastfeeding support services in Irish maternity units. So Deborah, thank you very much for being with us today. And could you maybe give us a glimpse into your own experience of having and feeding your baby?
So I had a very difficult experience of breastfeeding. It took me about 7 weeks to establish breastfeeding, and it began with my experience in hospital. I couldn't get my son to latch, and I was asking to see the lactation consultant. And the midwives were lovely and compassionate, but they just didn't have the time to sit with me. I needed somebody to sit there maybe an hour and a half, like several times a day, until I actually was able to establish it. And unfortunately, it's just not realistic with their workload that they could do that. I did receive conflicting advice. I eventually got to see the lactation consultant, and the advice that I got was not consistent with the advice I got later from an IBCLC. And I was also encouraged to introduce formula despite wishing to breastfeed. And so by the time I left the hospital, I was pumping and then feeding the express milk to my son, and then also topping up with formula. So by the time I left the hospital, I was in quite a bad way. It's very difficult to kind of, it's obviously difficult to be postpartum and trying to feed, but trying to feed in multiple ways at one time is just very, very difficult. So I was devastated that it wasn't working out. I began, by hiring an IBCLC who helped me, introduced nipple shields and I identified a tongue tie. So then I had a tongue tie procedure, which, costed a lot of money, and basically with time, and I got mastitis. I had to get medication from the doctor for that. I just felt like I hit every bump in the road. And in the end, I ended up spending about €700 as well to get there. And I suppose breastfeeding had been sold to me as, very natural, the cheapest option, all of these things, but also I was aware of the benefits of it. And so this was something I really, really wanted. So then for that to feel like that was being taken away from me, I was devastated. So, I eventually got there, and I was delighted, and I was so glad that I was able to get there. But I did feel like I got there because of being able to access, resources, having the financial support, having the support of my partner, living in an area where there was a lot of resources around, and then when I joined a breastfeeding group, I found out that my experience was not unique at all, that pretty much all the mothers there, maybe bar one, had similar experiences. So, and become friends with them. And so then the Lord Mayor, she mentioned about, suggestions on how to improve things. And so I said, well, I collate our experiences together with a survey. And I sent out a survey, and I ended up getting overwhelmed with 145 responses. And that's how Bainne Beatha, the campaign that you mentioned, how that began. So, this really confirmed for me each step. There was my experience, there was the small group, and then there was the larger group. And then since launching Bainne Beatha, and the response we got on social media is that this is a systemic issue. And, I think the messaging around, breastfeeding being beneficial is really out there, but you can't really put that message out if we're not actually going to provide the support to enable parents to get there, because that is a recipe for despair and grief and guilt, so there's something there that needs to be addressed. And so I'm delighted that this and even just to hear the words from the president and from Sabina Higgins was so encouraging, so that was my experience.
Thanks, Deborah. Unfortunately, it's not an uncommon story, as you've said yourself there. I admire your determination for taking the 7 weeks to get to where you want to. But can I just ask you, because I can see the comments coming in the Q&A already as well, and we will incorporate as many questions as we can today. But, when we do hear the messages, how good breastfeeding is, and, if that's something that you've chosen to do and you really want to do it, then the guilt that comes along with not being able to do it is actually something that's quite, it's very frustrating. It's very disheartening for women. And I understand that from myself. I had difficulties with both my boys But can you talk to me maybe about that guilt that comes along with not being able to feed your baby in the way that you want to?
Yeah, I think it's because many parents who decide I wish to breastfeed have probably researched it or have some kind of understanding of the benefits of it. So it's something you're kind of looking forward to, like I'm going to do the best for my child. I'm going to give them, that their first feed is breast milk, and we received that a lot in Bainne Beatha in our campaign of babies being taken to the NICU and finding out that the first feed was a formula milk when they had planned and wished to give breast milk. It's just something that you decide, this is what I wish for my child, and every step, I suppose, being a parent is you wanted to give your child the best. And if you believe that breastfeeding is the best for your child and then that choice is taken away from you, I think there's a lot of mothers think it's just them. They think that the failure is just them, but they're the failures, and that's where the guilt comes in. And not just guilt, but grief. I think even for my 7 weeks, I felt grief. I cried to everybody I saw, because this is something that was really rewarding had been taken away from me, had been robbed from me, and it was only by accessing supports, and thankfully there are brilliant supports out there, but it shouldn't really come down to luck and circumstance, which I feel at the moment, if it's not provided directly from hospital and directly from in the community as a standard, then it is going to come down to luck and circumstance, and that's not fair.
And I will come to that later with our panelists, Deborah, because there is a social inequality. If you're lucky enough to be able to pay for the support because that's what you want to do, wonderful. Or if you're lucky enough to be in the postcode lottery where there's a public lactation consultant or a GP and public health nurse who can support you, great. But for those that aren't, it's really not an equitable system. I want to thank you for all of the work that you've done with Bainne Beatha. I know you've been lobbying, you've spoken to the Oireachtas Health Committee, you've done so much work with being a new mother. And so thank you for that. And thank you also for sharing your story today, because I know it can be quite upsetting to have to revisit that, but I do think it's important to have set the context of that and to share your experience. So thank you sincerely, Deborah, and I hope you can tune in to the rest of the panel discussion that we have now. So I'm delighted now to introduce our panelists for the discussion today, to explore the different ways society needs to better protect and support families and examine the major hurdles to be overcome for breastfeeding and infant and toddler nutrition to be adequately protected from commercial influence. And I will actually say from the outset, I'm sorry, I am addressing babies and infants a lot, and that's my own personal biases because I haven't got to the toddler phase with both my boys, but yes, we're obviously incorporating toddlers in that conversation as well. So now I'm delighted to introduce our panelists for today. Our first panelist is Dr. Meredith Kenosha, who is a paediatric specialist registrar currently in a research role in neonatology at the Coombe Women and Infants University Hospital, pursuing an MD. Her research focuses on measuring breast milk flow and volume during breastfeeds and interventions to support establishment and continuation of breastfeeding in preterm infants. She's lead author on a paper from the Faculty of Paediatrics, Faculty of Public Health and Institute of Obstetricians and Gynecologists of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland, highlighting that despite improvements over the last 15 years, breastfeeding rates in Ireland remain below the international targets. And this report affirms that healthcare professionals should have the appropriate education and skill set to support breastfeeding, and affirms RCPI's commitment to the promotion of breastfeeding. So thank you very much, Meredith, for joining us today. Our next panelist, we have Gerard Hastings, Professor Emeritus at Stirling University. He researches the impact business has in society, both for good and ill, and this has involved him in advising government and civil society nationally and internationally. He's published widely in health and business journals. His latest book, Hyperconsumption, Corporate Marketing versus the Planet, is just going into production with Routledge. And in 2009, he was awarded an OBE for services to healthcare. In 2014, he accepted the Queen's Anniversary Prize on behalf of the University of Stirling. And Gerard, we're delighted to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
Our third panelist, we have Laura McHugh, who's the HSE National Breastfeeding Coordinator. She has been in that role since 2018 with the responsibility for driving the implementation of key actions within the HSE's National Breastfeeding Action Plan. The priority of area of work are improving the governance and health service structures to support breastfeeding, improving staffing and resources for breastfeeding support within maternity services and primary care, education and training for healthcare professionals, breastfeeding campaigns, and collection and monitoring of breastfeeding indicators. Laura previously worked as a senior health promotion officer in HSC West and has worked with peer-led primary healthcare program for travellers. She also spent her early years in the health services nursing at University Hospital Galway. Laura, thank you for joining us today. Our fourth panelist, we have Orla O'Connor, Director of the National Women's Council, the leading national women's membership organisation in Ireland with over 190 member groups. She was co-director of Together for Yes, the national civil society campaign to remove the 8th Amendment in the referendum, and was recognised as one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine in 2019 for this role. Orla is an expert in the policies needed to progress women's equality in Ireland and has led numerous high-level successful campaigns on a wide range of issues on women's rights, including social welfare reform, pension reform, and for the introduction of quality and affordable childcare. She's passionate about ensuring access to women's reproductive rights, ensuring more women are in leadership positions, about ending violence against women, and increasing women's economic equality. And Orla, thank you so much for being on our panel today. Finally, we have Dr. Elizabeth O'Sullivan. She received her PhD in nutritional sciences from Cornell University in 2016. Her dissertation research had specific emphasis on maternal and infant nutrition. Prior to commencing her role in TU Dublin, Dr. O'Sullivan worked as a postdoctoral research fellow within UCD's Perinatal Research Centre. Her research interests centre on feeding infants human milk, and this includes both feeding directly at the breast and feeding expressed human milk from a bottle. And Liz, thank you so much for joining us as well today. Now, Meredith, we've already had the address from Sabina Higgins give us some statistics on where we are in terms of infant feeding in Ireland, but can you maybe recap and give us a little bit more insight in terms of what our figures are in Ireland?
Yes, so in Ireland, I think the first thing that's important to recognise is that breastfeeding rates are increasing. So over the past 10 to 15 years, slowly but surely, the breastfeeding initiation rates, so those mothers who start to breastfeed their infants in hospital, has increased about 10 to 15%. Yet we're still at a point now where just over 60% of mothers choose to initiate breastfeeding within their hospital stay. And unfortunately, that does fall significantly by the time infants are about 3 months old. And we have data from public health nurses who are still visiting these families around 3 months. And we know that just over 40% of infants at that stage are still receiving some element of breast milk. And even lower numbers of those are actually receiving exclusive breast milk at that time. And following on from that, then we know that by 6 months of age, the breastfeeding rate is incredibly low. So the most recent statistics we have are that about 3 to 6% of infants are still exclusively breastfed by 6 months of age. And that would be the recommended duration by the WHO. So the other point being is that these are out of date or old statistics, and it's not something that has been measured for a number of years. So while I would hope that this is probably a number that is increased by now, we actually still are relying on nearly 10-year-old data to inform our practices now. So I would hope again that we've made some gains looking at those who are breastfeeding at 6 months, but it's not something that is well recorded or monitored.
That's a little bit worrying, Meredith, and I wasn't aware that the data that we're actually using is so old. It's obviously something that we need to keep in mind, because if we're going to be building policies and trying to be building new practices, we need the information, we need up-to-date data on that.
Definitely. And I mean, I think we do have good up-to-date data in terms of breastfeeding rates in hospitals and by 3 months. But I think extending that to 6 months would really give us even more information. Mm-hmm. And then we can target, are the rates significantly falling off after 3 months? Or are those who are able to breastfeed for 3 months, are they able to continue to the 6 months? And that may well be the case. But without that data, we don't really know where we stand.
Mm-hmm. You are lead author on the RCPI position paper highlighting the need for consistent education for healthcare professionals across specialities. And I guess that references some of Deborah's points that, you know, she was given information by one person which contradicted the information by another person. Can you detail for us what you envisage for education provision around infant feeding for healthcare professionals?
Yes, I think this is really one of the key points that came from looking into researching this document with the Royal College of Physicians. So they are the training body for many medical specialties within Ireland. And, you know, they have recognized and shown that this is something they're interested in targeting for medical professionals. So what I would see is that we would really need to start education quite early. And that means really with undergraduate medical education. So this is before people have specialized into things like pediatrics or obstetrics and gynecology or even general practice. And so this is all people who are graduating with a medical degree. And it's essential that this is part of their training. And following on from that, we would also see that postgraduate education is incredibly important. So yes, in pediatrics and perhaps general practice, we would be closely working with families and small babies. But really it's up to all doctors to have basic knowledge about the physiology and benefits of breastfeeding, and as well practical steps that they can take to help families who have chosen to breastfeed. And I think that practical aspect is one of the things that we can really, really improve on. So the Royal College of Physicians, the beauty of this paper was that it was a joint venture. So there was a lot of collaboration between pediatrics, obstetrics and gynecology, as well as public health, to try and recognize that this is everyone's responsibility. And then we also have buy-in from all of those stakeholders committing to the education of their postgraduate trainees as well. So I think that this is something that's really valuable. It's still in the works, it's still in the early phases, but we can already see more educational seminars and webinars such as this one and others in the future that are trying to provide that education and resources for people.
That conversation is really important. Briefly, Meredith, before I bring the conversation to our other panelists, that report that we're talking about, it also states that doctors need to be shielded from marketing and not take sponsorship anymore from formula companies. Why is this so important? I mean, if you do get a free pen, really, does it influence you that much?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that I think until you really sit down and look at it and question this yourself, it's very easy to think, you know, a free pen won't influence me. I know more than that, you know, it won't actually influence my thinking or influence information that I'm giving to people. And while that may be the case, we actually see from a lot of research, and Professor Hastings can probably talk to this a bit more, that it does make a difference. It does slowly influence people. And, you know, medical professionals, whether they're doctors, nurses, midwives, we're all susceptible to marketing. It's not something that you can just be immune to because you would like to be. So it's important that we recognize that and say, you know what, we should make this commitment. We should make this commitment as a group. From a organizational point of view, as well as from a personal point of view, to say, look, I'm not engaging with that. And I think that that is one big step that we can each take going forward.
Thanks, Meredith. And I will jump to you, Professor Hastings, on this. This is something you've been researching for your academic career, something I'm getting educated about myself, because I really have been of the mind that, you know, I'm reasonably good in my judgment. I think I'm reasonably well educated. Just because I'm seeing these ads in primetime television every evening doesn't mean that they're getting in. Is that really true? I mean, on reflection, I really have realized that they are, but surely we're not all that influential, or not that all that easily influenced.
I wouldn't say we're easily influenced. We're not mugs, we're not stupid, but yes, we are influenced because a great deal of effort and time and skill goes into making sure that these adverts and the rest of the marketing activity, because it's much more than just television advertising, it's everything that is done to encourage us to consume. And you just have to look at how much we consume across the board now to see how much marketing is impacting us, how much more we consume than our parents and grandparents consumed, for example, of all sorts. And then you can go into the academic research, and there's lots and lots of studies showing that tobacco advertising, alcohol advertising, fast food advertising, infant formula advertising does what it says on the tin, to coin a phrase. It gets us to do what the marketers want us to do. Now, at one level, you might say, well, what's the harm in that? The harm comes in because, as the president indeed said, the corporations like Nestle and Danone do not have our interests at heart. They have their shareholders' interests at heart. So despite the rhetoric of consumer sovereignty and the customer always comes first and all that sort of stuff, in reality, they're looking at share values, they're looking at bonuses, they're looking at returns to shareholders all the time. And that means that our interests get pushed to the side. So, this is harming babies, as we're discussing today, but it's harming the planet as well. We can see that we're just consuming ourselves to perdition. And this is, in a sense, the problems with breastfeeding and bottle feeding are a microcosm of that. It's inevitable this would be the case. So it suggests that this advertising, on the millions and millions of euros that are spent on this, are not doing anything.
And we'll touch on that global aspect, I think, a little bit later. And, if we go back to that guilt, like Jeannie Mackers, if you didn't feel guilty enough that you're already not breastfeeding your child, and then you realize you're harming the planet in the meantime. And that's something I've been grappling with all weekend, and I'm reading all this stuff because I am formula feeding my second boy. It just didn't work out, to be honest. The supports weren't there. It was part of the pandemic. And that's the decision that we made, and we're living with that now. But as I'm reading all this information, Gerard, around the industry, that it's increasing 8% year on year globally. I mean, if I was in shares, I'd be buying shares in formula companies. But what I find quite cynical about it are the production of what they're doing with follow-on milks. Can you, for example, maybe discuss that and how they really try and get us into their product by using this 1, 2, 3, 4 stepwise system?
Yeah, happy to talk about that. I think as a starting point, it's important to recognise that marketers don't have so much hard power as soft power. So they don't compel us to consume their products. They can't compel us to, by and large. There are exceptions to that, but by and large, they seduce us. And that means that the consumption process feels good. So they make us feel better about what we are doing. So when you talk about guilt, they try and assuage that guilt and make you feel okay about buying an SUV and driving down to Tesco's to buy stuff that's been ripped off from the farmers who couldn't afford to sell it, and so on. But they make us feel good. The principal tool they have for that is branding, because that you've got a generic product, a bottle of milk powder or a box of milk powder. You start to put on a beautiful image of a baby, and then some beautiful font and some nice descriptions and lovely colours, pastel shades, aspirational colouring like gold. Then people begin to feel a bit better about it. So actually, we end up in the modern world, and then from formulas, no exception to this. We're buying brands, not products. We're buying emotions. We're buying hopes and dreams. And the people who market these things spend a lot of time studying us to understand exactly what our hopes and dreams are, and trying to get across to our essential humanity and cater to that. And with the branding, what they have done in a very manipulative way is create 4 brands, typically 4 stages of milk, all branded the same, so it's all part of the same journey. Technically, they are not promoting first milk, which they're not allowed to do. They're promoting second, third, and fourth milk. But emotionally, it's the same stuff. It's the same cuddly bear, and it's the same gold, it's the same font, it's the same name. And so what they end up doing is selling the whole package of commodified feeding for babies and making us feel very good about it. And as somebody said earlier, there's no comparative advertising going on for the natural alternative. So they've got open season.
Yeah, and I'm going to bring that question to Laura in 1 second. But I did want to ask you one more thing, Gerard, because I do find it very interesting at the moment that there seems to be an othering happening, and I don't know where that's coming from, but in the background there seems to be a deliberate attempt to kind of have, well, there's the mothers who breastfeed, and then there's the mothers who bottle feed, And, you know, they're just different. And one group is feminist and one group is anti-feminist. And there's a kind of I think that it's an effort to draw a line between breastfeeding mothers and non-breastfeeding mothers, when in fact, a lot of mothers do both. And there's no mention of the combination feeding or as people that might do one for a while and the other for a while, but there does seem to be a created division almost. Could you provide any insight into that and where that might be coming from?
You give a very good example, Aoibhinn, of the industry is very aware of this. Life in general, but parenting in particular, has become quite fractured. There are people who do this and people who do that. And they actually ran an enormous campaign in North America exactly to talk about that, and ending up with the idea that so how you choose to feed your baby is simply that, a choice, and all choices are equal. And it's like a sort of a little bottled, concentrated version of a consumer capitalist society. Consumer choice is sacred. Consumer choice is more important than evidence. It's more important than the baby's health. The fact that we can choose this product and not that product, that is absolutely sacrosanct. And I think that what you're touching on there is this process of commodifying something that really should not be commodified. By all means, you know, there are people who are going to need to bottle feed for whatever reasons. That decision should be made on a level playing field, not one that's been completely corrupted and confused by one vested interest that's trying like crazy to get you stuff that'll make them rich, to get you to consume stuff that'll make them rich.
But how do you level that playing field, Gerard? Is it as simple as implementing the WHO code, which is, you know, 40 years old and says you should really not advertise anything to an infant or a child up to 36 months? Would that solve it?
Well, I mean, actually, there's ample evidence of exactly what you should do here, and it's both in the UK and in Ireland. We have moved on tobacco in this way. We've removed all the advertising, promotion, marketing for these products, and certainly we've had a study going in the UK for the last 20 years, and it's been amazingly successful. Teenagers can't even name a tobacco brand now. Teenage smokers fallen off a cliff. So yeah, you get rid of the damn stuff, and that's what the WHO code tried to do. The industry, with their malarkey and their money, have got round it, particularly by the way you highlighted, by this branding exercise of 1, 2, 3, and 4, so they can carry on advertising even though they're not supposed to be. And so, in a sense, it always plays into their hand, because they can go publicly and say, "Oh, of course we obey the WHO code, you know, because we're only advertising 2, 3, and 4, not 1." So they get the best of both worlds. I feel very passionately that we just have to grasp this nettle and say, this has just got to stop. And it took us a long time to get there with tobacco. We eventually did. And it took a long time to get all those measures in place, because industry fights back tooth and claw. But we can do it for teenagers, we can do it for babies.
I really like that hopeful message, Gerard. And I'm going to bring that to Laura, because, you know, taking on the tobacco industry, it seemed like such a hot potato at the time, but it was done. And I imagine that there was a massive lobbying force behind that. Can we do the same in this country? Because in your role, Laura, you know, you're really up against it, because really there's no way that the HSE or the Department of Health is going to be able to pay for the same amount of prime time ads that the formula companies have, or the same marketing that we see in the supermarkets, or the freebies that you might get in your new mom packs and on social media because they realize that you're pregnant. Or maybe you can, you know, maybe one question has come in there. There was a really successful marketing campaign around COVID. Could there be the same around breastfeeding? What do you need, I guess, is my question to you, to support you in that role?
Yeah, so I think we have to think about where we've come from, and women and babies generally have been very disproportionately affected in terms of investment and funding, but that is changing. And I do feel there is significantly in the last 18 months, there's been a change, and there's been an alignment of HSE policy, really listening to the feedback that our mothers are telling us through our National Maternity Strategy, the National Patient Experience Survey, and of course through Deborah's work on Bainne Beatha, and really kind of given kind of serious consideration to all of the proposals that we have put forward in our national plan, and putting some significant investments in our supports. So like, I mean, we can do a lot with very committed, educated people in the health services. And significantly in the last couple of years, we have directors of midwifery in every maternity service. Those senior leadership positions in the HSE have been critical to making sure that all of the communications, all of the messaging, all of the training supports that we know are needed to make sure our staff are up to speed on all of the different kind of tactics and all of the different responsibilities they have in terms of how they deliver information and messaging on choice and that kind of stuff. Like we've yeah, we have, I think we have the better foundations being built, because we know in our, say, our public health nursing services, for example, currently only 30% of our services have a free lactation consultant support available. But with the significant investment and funding, particularly from the Minister for Health this year, it will mean that every public health nursing area will have access to free lactation consultant supports. So, you know, that'll be really critical to helping mums to feed for as long as they wish, because they will have go-to places, and we'll have staff there who can facilitate breastfeeding groups, kind of network in with hospitals, and particularly they are a great police in making sure that industry are kept out, and that our public My Child information sources and our booklets and our and only kind of really evidence-based information like from Safe Food that is given out, and that there's no opportunities given to industry to influence our staff with study days or events or other informational allergies. We don't need them. We have quite, I suppose, available services now through our public health nursing and our dietetic services, and particularly our My Child publications, that there is no need for these industry presentations to us.
And yet
we have channels too.
And yet they're there. And I know the HSE have just launched their own code, and it's really strong. I mean, I was reading all the policies there, and congratulations on all the work that you've done, because it really does seem like you're kind of creating a boundary there that the companies aren't going to be allowed in to, connect with the doctors and the nurses and the midwives. But you are still up against this massive industry. Like, it's almost like you need your own brand manager and smart and marketing strategy, as an audience member has observed there. Can I ask, like, is there a need to get more political will behind this? We have this wonderful maternity strategy, we have this wonderful breastfeeding action plan. When you read them on paper, it fills you with hope and joy, because you're just like, wow, if this gets implemented, we're going to be just so great in supporting new mothers and families from start to finish in pregnancy, labor, and then actually going on to feed them. But is there a lack of political will in actually trying to implement an action timeline these plans?
Yeah, so we have been looking for funding for quite a while, and it's only now we are getting the resources we need. The National Breastfeeding Action Plan has been, I suppose, implemented within existing resources and through nurture funding. So certainly in terms of improving supports from our end, any bids we put in for funding, having those accepted and kind of funded would be very helpful. But from our end as well, I mean, parents are online. We really need to up our game with the availability of public information and restricting access, to people. We have a very successful mychild.ie campaign, 3.4 million visits in 2020. We know where we need to be in terms of meeting the needs of parents, but also, as Gerard said, so do the formula companies. So, when most people are checking out their phones, and that parents don't, and pregnant mothers don't need targeted ads coming to them, and being in competition with other, with our other mychild.ie sources. And it's really unfair, and it's just that, parents are being subjected, to this and creating doubt, in their minds. So yes, our public information sources, we are constantly looking at expanding that, and we are through Launch Care funding as well, expanding our mychild.ie, and we do have books available for all people at the antenatal stage, and when they go home from hospital, everyone gets an evidence-based 0-2 guide, which has lots of choice in it. It gives lots of evidence-based information, all feeding options and that, but but certainly I would feel that there should be greater political will put into stopping advertising at all parents, which will help obesity, which will help lots of healthy lifestyle measures. And it's really unjust that our parents are being exposed, you know, to this from industry.
And on that, Laura, you know, sometimes, like, to be honest, my heart's kind of going out to you, because you are doing an awful lot of work, and yet it can be so easily undermined, because I could be on my phone and an ad will flash up, as happens to me quite regularly, because they know that I am buying formula, and it's easy to target that in that regard. So, you know, I do think we do need to talk to our legislators and make sure that they are protecting our families in that regard. But can I ask you just one thing? And again, it's a question that's come in. It's something that I've come across myself. I'm the mother representative in the National Maternity Hospital, and this has come up that, you know, across all the maternity units, simple things like, well, first of all, having lactation consultants there, you've addressed there will be more lactation consultants being funded right now. Hopefully that will be no longer that postcode lottery, but also tongue tie facilities. It's so prevalent that, you know, if a baby can't latch, it's probably due to tongue tie, and if that was assessed and acted on in the hospital before you left, as it is in other EU countries, that would just be so much easier for the mothers who are desperately trying, if they wanted to feed their child and that doesn't work with the tongue tie. But is it, I guess the question is, how difficult is it to introduce practices like that when, for example, the HSE isn't really in any way able to govern what happens? It's just to advise what happens in the maternity.
Yeah, so you know, in relation to all, you know, issues with regards to positioning attachments at early stage, having very, I suppose, skilled people to assess breastfeeding, and we are spending a lot of work in terms of developing a national standardized program, and then having people available with more lactation consultants available in our hospital community, that people get you know, a skilled assessment of what's going on for them, and then that there's proper follow-up on that. Because as we know, like an awful lot of the management with latch issues, and particularly tongue tie, you need to see somebody skilled who is able to support you, and it's often, you know, the positioning attachment issues that are needed, and then a very small proportion of people need to get you know, further treatment. But at all stages, that's a significant challenge that people need ongoing support with, and continuity of care between our hospital and our, you know, and our community services. So yeah.
Okay, thanks, Orla. And I think let's keep the questions coming in, but also I think the way to come at this is how can you be best supported to implement the breastfeeding action plan, and how can that be best protected, I guess, going forward. So if you can give us things to do, what we could do to help you in your role, Laura, that may be very helpful as well. Orla, we've already touched on so much in the discussion today, and I think for me, what's really coming across is the importance of highlighting this issue to our decision makers, to the health minister, and to our policymakers, our legislators that may not necessarily have an understanding of the depth of this problem. You know, how can we get that across? And, you know, you as the director of the National Women's Council, you're often at those tables where those discussions are taking place.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is events like this are really, really important in terms of raising this awareness, and that's why we were really delighted to partner on this. And I think a really important piece out of this webinar is the statement from the President and Sabina Higgins, because it does need high-level senior leadership in the country to say, this is important, this is impacting, it's impacting on children, it's impacting on women's health. So that really senior level piece, I think, is absolutely critical. But we're also at a really important moment as well in terms of the cycle of the year, because we know that we're coming up to a budget, and it's really important, I think, that this is raised in the context of the budget in terms of some of the things that Laura mentioned that really do need resourcing in order to fully happen. And that's about the supports, whether that's supports in hospitals or in primary care settings, but it's also in that public awareness piece. And I mean, we certainly know that in the Women's Council from women who contact us, like, it is absolutely still about, you know, very much about feeling uncomfortable in places, and the whole societal piece about, you know, why breastfeeding, why women want to breastfeed, and why this needs to be seen as a societal norm. So I think there's probably no, you know, there's no one piece that's going to solve, you know, that's going to solve this. It needs to come from different places, but particularly in terms of that senior political leadership, it needs action in terms of resources, and it needs a much bigger conversation in society that can, you know, I think both understand the importance of this and the impact of it, and to really change how we view breastfeeding, so that it's not something, you know, to be hidden away, which I think is the experience. And the other thing, just to say, because I was really struck by when Deborah was talking about that sense of, you know, well, you sort of feel lucky if you happen to get all the supports. And I think that's a critical piece, because that's definitely what women say to us. You know, if they can just meet the right person in the hospital, meet the right, if it's district health nurse or whoever, it's one person maybe really giving that support, intervening, and for many women that they don't get that. So there's a really critical piece here about how we ensure that high quality support is there for women where they want to access it, and I think we're lacking in that right now.
Well, a question has come in from Senator Roisin Garvey on that. Like, how can we help? You know, obviously we have, you know, hundreds of attendees. There's great interest in this panel discussion today. So I imagine people are feeling like, well, I'd like this issue to be changed. I certainly do not want another new mum going through the same things. You're already exhausted. And this is the frustrating thing about this issue, is that it doesn't matter to you until it matters to you. And then when it matters to you, you've got so much else on. It's just a very big thing to take on. So what can we do, be that in the political sphere, in our communities, you know, what is your advice on that, Orla?
I think, I mean, and unfortunately, I think for a lot of progress in women's health, it is about campaigning. It's about supporting the campaigns that are there to advance this issue, about supporting, you know, if it's Bainne Beatha or the Baby Feeding Law Group, are campaigns of the National Women's Council. But it is about a sort of public campaigning, letting your TD know. I mean, it's real, you know, ABCs of campaigning, letting your TD know, this is important to me. This is why you need to resources. This is why we need more lactation supports. So it's about getting it into the public arena and the public conversation. And the other piece as well that I think is important, and again, it was one of the things, you know, really from Deborah's contribution, women's experiences are key in this. And it's really important that we learn from women's experiences and that we listen to those experiences. And there's a whole piece of work going on within the Department of Health in the new Women's Health Action Plan called Radical Listening Exercise, where lots of experiences about different, you know, it can be different experiences in relation to health in that instance, but it is very much about placing the experiences at the heart of policy change. And I think that is really critical. And so it is really important that we listen to women, we hear what they're saying about the type of supports that they need and where they need them and what suits them best. And I think that's an important piece in terms of a wider campaign of how we need to approach this.
I want to bring in one last question to you, Orla. This is coming from Maria Herron, who is a breastfeeding researcher, and she's an administrator of a group called Code Monitoring Northern Ireland, where people are concerned about aggressive marketing. Now, the Director of Corporate Affairs and Head of Nutrition for Danone or Cowingate was recently appointed to the advisory committee of the all-island body Safe Food, and given Safe Food's remit to provide healthy eating and food safety advice, what do the panel think about this conflict of interest? And Maria says that her group wrote both to the Irish Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, and the Northern Ireland Health Minister, Robin Swan, but to date, neither minister has acknowledged that there's a conflict of interest with this appointment. Orla, I'll take that to you, and Meredith, I might jump to you on this afterwards.
Yeah, well, I mean, what that points to, and I think, you know, even in terms of our whole discussion, so you know, there's one half of this which is about the focus on women and how we support, you know, how we support mothers in terms of breastfeeding and what needs to be done. And then there's the whole other piece, which is what, you know, Gerard was talking about in terms of what are we doing about the companies, the marketing, the promotion, and also the movement into spaces where they can have huge influence, which is obviously what's being raised. And I think for a large part in Ireland, that's the whole piece. The corporate piece is the piece that's got totally ignored. And that's why, I mean, I really thought there was a really strong message from the president today on that this needs to be taken on. It needs to be called out, and we need much harder action, such as the WHO code. So, you know, I think there's, you know, rightly, we need to be looking at all the supports that women need, but this piece about the corporate, you know, both the money that's made from these companies, but they're, you know, the whole impetus behind them. It's not about women's health. It is about making money. And also there's huge implications as well beyond Ireland in terms of what's happening globally for women from these companies. So I think, you know, I think that's absolutely critical, but the movement of those companies into critical spaces such as that has to be questioned by the government and really shouldn't be allowed to take place.
If they are questioned, then that's not being acknowledged. I mean, that's a whole other issue there. And perhaps some of the legislators that are listening to the webinar today can take that to heart and maybe, you know, maybe echo some of the concerns that have been said here. Meredith, from the healthcare perspective, can you share your feedback on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a clear conflict of interest there. And when we're talking about HSE resources and things like that, and including Safe Food for the Republic of Ireland and the North, we do endorse those, and we need to be sure that this information is coming from unbiased sources, and there is not this industry influence in terms of the policies and the guidelines that we're giving to families. So I would completely agree that, you know, that it's a huge conflict of interest, and it's not necessary. You know, there are many, many specialists in these areas that we can look to for advice and guidance. So I think as a conflict of interest, it's clear, and it's something that does need to be addressed.
Meredith, I wanted to jump back to you and ask you, it's another question that's come in from one of our audience members about supports for breastfeeding beyond maternity services. So if you are a woman who happens to be breastfeeding, but you have to go to A&E or you have to go in for some surgery or something like that, there aren't always those supports there for pumping or for, you know, keeping your milk cold, all these kinds of things. What is the RCPI position on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would go so far as to say there are rarely those supports in place outside of maternity hospitals. And again, I don't think this is due to any malicious reasoning, but it's just that it has not been accounted for. People haven't thought it through. And there are plenty of women who end up being in hospital or attending health services or for scans who are breastfeeding. And thankfully, there are more and more women who are in that position. So this, in a way, goes back to education of physicians. So no matter what area they're working in, they should be familiar with the needs of breastfeeding people. And we would say from the position paper that there should be facilities in general hospitals for women who are expressing or to feed their babies. And it is not a huge amount of resources that would be required because, again, they're not huge numbers, but just having a small room, a breast pump, a fridge where you could store expressed milk if you're admitted to hospital and you can't send your milk out. These are really, really key things. And just going that extra step and having some protocol in place for that in a general hospital would go a long, long way to make people feel that it's important and that it's normal to be breastfeeding.
But again, this falls back to your earlier point, I imagine, of conversations and education for healthcare professionals overall, not just in the maternity units. Laura, there's a lot of questions in on current practices within the HSE, but I guess one that links up with what we were talking about with Meredith earlier is that need for the data and statistics. Can you tell us where we are in terms of, because I think that is within the breastfeeding action plan,
yeah,
updating the data and the statistics that we're using right now.
Yeah, so we've in terms of the breastfeeding rates themselves, we have 4 time points currently in the HSE, and then internally when we look at performance indicators or looking at benchmarks for how we're doing in terms of standards practice, there was an infant feeding audit done in 2019, and then we have obviously the National Maternity Experience Survey findings by individual unit, and those quality improvement plans happening arising from there. So we have a number of different, I suppose, sources of information that we are currently collecting data on. We would like to be collecting data at later time points to 6 months, because as you alluded to there, the data is quite old. We would really, we need to understand where we're at, currently in Ireland, and at this time point, we don't know how many mums are breastfeeding at 6 months or what their experiences are. So that's certainly, a gap in the data. But yeah,
it's possible to collect that, like within the systems that you have, within the structures that you have.
There is an opportunity later on at the public health nursing visit, which takes place later than 6 months. There could be an opportunity to to do that, and we have looked at the definitions for that. So that's something that would be on our radar for looking at within the public health nursing visit at a later stage.
One other question there, in terms of legislative support, that maybe it is it under the remit of the Department of Health, do you know, or does that legislation reside within the Department of Communications, the Broadcasting Authority, Department of Justice? In your experience, where does that legislative support for ring fencing the advertising? So if you can look after the maternity supports and getting those more robust, and on the other wing, where does that sit as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware, it's either Department of Health or maybe a wider Department of Communications department. Like the type of restricting advertising we're talking about is outside the scope of the HSE in the Department of Health. It's really looking at our broadcasting, what comes through our tellies or what comes through our phones, and changing that, because and stopping that, so that it's not competing with our public healthing messages or recommendations that parents, regardless of how they feed their baby, parents deserve better choice of information and evidence-based information coming to their phones, and not targeted. Not algorithms coming from industry when you're Googling brown bread mixes or that. It's important to note as well, I suppose, from our own services, that we have a lot of very we have a lot of leaders across our system who would take very proactive steps in addressing any breaches that may come to light. Personally, we hear of some of them, and there's generally 1 to 2 every year. But our senior midwifery and medical colleagues across the HSE, they would take very active measures and stamp out. There's a recent study day that just never came to light. We found an alternative source of funding for that through the National Maternity Strategy this year, and people were reminded of their responsibilities, and we didn't need that company to be providing that education event, and we don't need our HSE staff with our job titles associated with any industry event, and according to this policy, our new HSE policy, HSE facilities, institutions, or job titles should never be associated, and become an extension of the marketing department, for the formula companies.
Great to see that, Laura, and congratulations on all your work in getting that to pass and getting it through. I just wanted to put something towards you here, another suggestion from one of the attendees. Could lactation consultant visits be potentially put in the medical card? Because it is, and I meant to actually ask that earlier, because it's a social inequity issue, because rates for mums breastfeeding are far lower in areas where there's socioeconomic disadvantage, and potentially could you envisage, things like that being put in the medical card, and that would perhaps.
Well, with all the lactation consultants that will come into post or currently in post, they're all a free service. So anybody who comes through our door through the public, system, be it if you come in through a public patient or a private patient, it doesn't matter. If you see a HSE lactation consultant, it's a free service, and all of these additional supports that will be put in remain so. As you alluded to there, it's really unjust that some of the services available in the community are only available to private, are only provided on a private basis, and then there may be some compensation between, private health insurance and that. But from our interest, we have looked at the prioritization of where these posts should go, and it is based on birth rates, it's based on deprivation, it's based on where there's resources already there in place, and particularly where we're looking at trying to increase breastfeeding rates where the rates are really, really low. So supposed to reassure people that there will be public available lactation consultant supports to a greater degree within our maternity services, particularly our larger maternity units, where there's 7,000 or 9,000 births every year. There's a greater demand, I suppose, in terms of the need for availability of lactation consultants in those hospitals, much more so than maybe some of the smaller units. And then every public health nursing area will have some hours of lactation support available.
Great, thanks, Laura. Gerard, just to bring you back in on this, and in the Irish market, for example, we've had a lot of ministerial photographs with launching of new formula products and launching of new formula companies and support of that. What would your advice be to government if you were consulting, for example, on this, on how to increase breastfeeding supports and rates? And would you have any advice to hand maybe on those kinds of events?
Yeah, first of all, this just confirms what we were saying earlier on. Cabinet ministers are no more immune to marketing than doctors are, or the rest of us. So that they are being marketed to very actively. Companies do focus on other people other than mothers. So, doctors and politicians are very important targets. So yeah, absolutely do. I think that needs to stop. What's effectively happening with this marketing is that these companies are establishing a sort of attractive persona in the public. So it becomes acceptable to sit down to dinner with these people or play golf with these people. And that needs to stop. And the phrase that needs to be loud and clear on the foreheads of every ministry is conflict of interest. You can't do this. This is just not acceptable to be hand in glove with people who are doing such harm. When we look across the world, the harm to public health being done by bottle feeding is sobering.
And are there other lessons then that could be taken from the legislative actions against the tobacco companies that you've mentioned earlier, for example?
It is a good example, because there are very few cabinet ministers in Ireland or in the UK who would sit down publicly with a tobacco company executive. That is not acceptable anymore. And I think we've talked a lot about brand over the last hour or so. And what we need to do is undermine the brands of the formula companies and boost our own brand. There's been a lot in the questions about whether we can use some of their tactics. And I think we can. I'm not suggesting for a minute we manipulate like the companies do, but we can put resource into understanding what women's needs are and catering to those needs. I think essentially what marketing is about.
One lovely undermining, well, not undermining, it was just the promotion of breastfeeding, was the Christmas card from President Michael D. Higgins, which was Mary breastfeeding her son. And that was just a lovely Christmas card, and very subtle, a very nice way of doing things. Orla, I just wanted to bring you back on this, because we were kind of touching on this issue earlier. This isn't just a health issue, that it's kind of more than that, because breastfeeding, it's cost effective, but it's non-resource intensive and it's sustainable. And we probably need to think about that more than the national context.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And again, I think it was really good the President talking about, we need to be talking about this within our poverty strategies, yes, within our health strategies and our food strategies, but much wider than that. And I also think it's really important as well in thinking about it, it's also about the supports that are provided in workplaces. And we have seen an extension of, parental leave. The Women's Council want to see much more of that to be paid, so that there's, so they're really supporting parents. And that's really critical, because for a long time we've sort of been at, we do have the 6 months maternity leave, but beyond that, we're into that sort of unpaid territory, and that's not supportive. I also think it's very important because there's, current conversations about the swapping of maternity leave. And I think it's really important that we talk about leave in addition to what's there, and paid leave in addition to what's there. And I think that's a critical piece. And it's also, I think that it's also part of that global conversation, because, we know that in countries where there are far less things like paid leave, it's much harder for mothers to be able to do that. So I think we need to support that as well in terms of the struggle for women's rights in employment. And particularly, I think that, as I said, the piece that the President was saying in terms of our anti-poverty strategies as well.
And this probably jumps into the Women's Health Action Plan. I mean, all of this, it's complex and it's all integrated.
Yeah, there's a real critical moment now in Ireland, because we're developing the Women's Health Action Plan, which will be completed by the end of the year. And I'm delighted, Rona Gaynor, who's leading that in the Department of Health, is one of the participants here. So this is a really critical piece, and it's really important that this becomes part of it. And it's seen as a comprehensive piece across our health system, but also making those linkages into the other departments and the other responsibilities of ministers.
And it's often those issues that aren't just within one department that fall through the cracks. And I guess that's one way to think about this. Is an issue that really does span a lot of different sections, a lot of different departments. I'm going to bring in Dr. Liz O'Sullivan now, because we've been on for almost a full hour and a half. We've touched on an awful lot. So Liz, you have the daunting task of maybe pulling out some of the pertinent points that you've heard today, because this is all very much relevant to your own work, your own research, and you're a mother of 2 very small children. So thank you very much for making the time as well, for being with us today. But, you know, from what you've heard today from Meredith, Gerard, Laura, Orla, what are the key elements that we might be able to consider in terms of supporting mothers just make those informed decisions about feeding their babies?
Great, thanks so much, Aoibhinn. I suppose just to reiterate and I explain where I'm coming from here. I am a mother of 2. I breastfed my daughter until she was just over 3.5, and I'm currently breastfeeding my 8-month-old son. So, you know, breastfeeding is something I'm really passionate about and very interested in, but I'm also a dietitian and a lecturer in nutrition. And so I recognize and acknowledge that there are situations where families are using infant formula, where perhaps a woman can't breastfeed or chooses not to breastfeed. So in those instances, you know, formula is absolutely a necessary product, and it's something that people are using. So while I am a strong kind of breastfeeding supporter, Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland is an alliance of organisations that I'm a member of, and we're very interested in ensuring that nutrition legislation is appropriate and strengthened for the benefit of all families. So those who are breastfeeding, formula feeding, and like you said, even combination feeding. So using a mixture of the two. So it's not a dichotomy that we have here. We don't have one group versus another group. And so we've heard an awful lot over the last hour or so. And, you know, it can seem quite daunting because it seems like we have a lot to do. I think it's important to recognize how far we've come and all of the positive changes that we have seen. So, you know, particularly that funding for increased international board certified lactation consultant posts, which was announced in May, and hopefully those will start to get filled soon. We've heard from Meredith that our breastfeeding rates are increasing in Ireland, which is great. And, you know, over the last 18 months, you know, during our global pandemic that we've observed, we've really seen our volunteer organizations, so Lelechli, Quidju and Friends of Breastfeeding, really step up and provide a phenomenal support to families online, and they should really be applauded for all of that hard work that they do and continue to do. And in terms of what else needs to be done and kind of pulling together what's been talked about here, I think we need to reflect back on the theme for the webinar, which is shared responsibility. So, and we need to think about how all sectors of society can contribute to promoting the optimal environment for ensuring families are appropriately informed and then supported in the decision they make with regards to feeding their infants, toddlers and young children. And particularly then, like I mentioned, the current global pandemic, with this infectious disease pandemic, it should never be, or it has never been as clear of the value of public health and public health interventions and public health measures. And supporting infant feeding is the very first public health measure that we can and should introduce, you know, setting our, you know, future members of our adult population off on the right start, on the best foot. So pulling in what we've talked about over the last hour or so, there are 2 things that really need to go hand in hand. We need to limit the marketing of infant formula. I know people say, you know, oh, you know, we're not idiots, we get it, you know, we're not influenced by marketing, and everybody thinks that. But everybody is, you know, there are subliminal messages. It's very hard to get away from them. You know, we mentioned earlier the branded pens and how healthcare workers can be influenced by those, but it's not just healthcare workers, it's the clients they serve who see them using a branded pen, and that acts as somewhat of an endorsement. So these things are insidious. We know they work because if they didn't work, companies wouldn't spend an absolute fortune on them. So really limiting that will have an influence. but it has to go hand in hand with providing skilled support to mothers to meet their infant feeding goals and the infant feeding decisions that they've made. And the government really needs to step up here and lead by example, because they have the capacity to do most good by implementing legislation and strategies that people must abide by. So we have a National Breastfeeding Action Plan that Laura McHugh described. We need to appropriately fund it, implement it, monitor our progress, revise it, and then repeat this cycle again. So this is not something that we just do once and we just implement and fund this one action plan. This needs to be something that we are consistently doing and learning from over time. And that's really, you know, the fundamental way that we run public health campaigns. And so we need to be looking at how it's faring, how we're doing. Are we meeting the goals that we've set? If not, why not? And now, you know, we start again at the next cycle. So make sure that this plan is rolled over and continued. So that's really important. And obviously at the moment, things in the health service are difficult. You know, we have a lot of people who are worked to capacity, and, you know, we have struggles within the maternity services. But infant feeding is just too important to be something that gets pushed down the list of priorities. We know that breastfeeding reduces morbidity and mortality from infectious respiratory diseases. So in light of COVID, you know, now's the time that we really need to wake up and realize funding these infant feeding policies needs to be on the top of our priorities list. And so we mentioned the WHO Code of Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes. That exists for the protection of all families. This is not a policy that specifically relates to breastfeeding. It's about ensuring that people have the appropriate information from unbiased sources. So we've heard from Professor Hastings about the impact of marketing practices on the public, and we can't be getting our information about infant feeding from companies who stand to gain financially from the choices that we make. So that information needs to come from independent and unbiased sources. We need consistent, clear, reliable information. So it's great that Laura McHugh talked about the HSE having their own policy there with regards to the code. So we need to make sure that our healthcare professionals are kind of providing a clear and consistent message, and it's unbiased. So it's information based. And this isn't a case where we want people to not talk about infant formula and kind of shield infant formula away. Like I said at the start here, infant formula is a product that people may need to use, and they need to be, you know, informed how to do that and supported how best to do that and how to do that in the safest and most appropriate way. So the code really kind of describes how that should work. So we need to make sure that the consistent and clear message is amplified and meets mothers and families. I think a couple of people made the point that women and families are online and on social media so much. So I think that there's a bit of work that needs to be done there in ensuring that healthcare professionals are on those platforms and are spreading the message and silencing the misinformation, which is something in the field of nutrition outside of kind of breastfeeding and infant feeding. We see a lot of misinformation, and there's really a job of work to be done to silence that and ensure that the appropriate messages are being delivered. So there needs to be some presence online. So along with providing skills support for breastfeeding and infant feeding and limiting the marketing, I think we also need to look at other legislation, particularly around lactation breaks. So at the moment, we are nationally mandated to provide lactation breaks up to 26 weeks postpartum. So all women are entitled to breaks until their baby is 26 weeks old. But the vast majority of people are also entitled to maternity leave up until nearly that point. So it seems somewhat pointless to then have legislation to allow you lactation breaks up to then. And so what we have at the moment is that various sectors of society have kind of lobbied very successfully to change the rules within their little employment sector. So not little even, so it's teachers, civil servants, and those employed by the HSE are entitled to breastfeeding breaks up till their baby is 2 years, which is the time point. The HSE would recommend that we breastfeed our babies for 2 years or beyond, as long as desired by mum and baby. And so I think this is something that needs to be equitable across all job sectors. So what we currently have is some babies having less access to breast milk than others. And I think all children deserve the same access to breast milk, regardless of the job their mother holds. President Higgins earlier described a mother's right to breastfeed, which I absolutely agree with. And I also think we need to consider a child's right to be breastfed. And this is something that needs to be facilitated at government level. We can't have a situation where there's a proportion of our society who are facilitated to breastfeed for longer than others. It's not fair.
Mm-hmm.
And then in terms of, that's kind of supporting those who are continuing to breastfeed and who, want to continue up to 2 years. But we've heard a lot about kind of the decrease in breastfeeding rates from hospital to the kind of immediate postpartum period, or even kind of that earlier into kind of the 3 months postpartum. And, a few people have mentioned, Sabina Higgins particularly, and Meredith mentioned that we need people at all stages of life to be aware of breastfeeding, see it as something normal. We need people to see other people breastfeeding, because we know, it's proven in the scientific literature that people who are aware of others who have breastfed are more likely to breastfeed themselves. So this is something where, change will come slowly at the beginning, but it will come. So the more people we see breastfeeding, the more knowledge that there is out there, the more we can implement breastfeeding education into the education system from those very young ages, like Sabina Higgins said. That's how we're going to slowly change the behavior of our country, because it's not just seeing people breastfeeding, it's seeing somebody breastfeeding and then knowing where to go if you need some help or support. If you've seen one friend and you know that they have breastfed, then that's where you're going to go. So even I had that personal experience. Before I had my first child, I had done a PhD with a sole focus on breastfeeding, but that was reading things in books, and that only gets you so far. And I knew that if I needed help and support afterwards, somebody who had personal experience of breastfeeding is going to be the best person to talk to. So I had my husband primed and ready with my 3 friends who may not have been the people that I would kind of speak to on a daily basis, but I was like, if I'm struggling, phone one of these 3 people, because they're the ones who will know, how to help and how to speak to me. And so I was in that lucky, privileged position where I had those people and I knew who they were. And I think slowly, with the more kind of breastfeeding we observe, the more of this that we will have for other women. So you need to have that kind of community support. We always say it takes a village to raise a baby, but it certainly does take a lot of support and help to breastfeed one.
It certainly does. And I think, that also speaks to Sabina's point at the beginning, that the older generations were really told that, the formula was better, than the breast milk. And oftentimes, and I've experienced it myself, even though both my mum and my granny breastfed, they were both telling me, I think that child is hungry and he needs formula. And it took a lot of energy to go, no, he's fine. I've got enough milk. I know I do. But you do need to surround yourself with the people who are of the same mind as you, whatever mind that is, because it's just a lot of energy. But Liz, you're ending us on a high point where, I feel positive that and hopeful that, change will come, just slowly at first. And I think there's been so much interest today that I think it's certain that change will happen now. And I just want to bring in, because there have been so many specific questions pouring in, we just won't be able to get to all of them, but I think it shows the commitment and the interest and the need for deeper and wider discussion on this topic. We have an attendee suggesting an alliance, maybe the next steps, to get an alliance together to take on perhaps the marketing of harmful products, not just the formula companies, but alcohol, junk food, the tobacco, the e-cigarettes. So that's just one suggestion that's come in there. And I just want to thank you, Liz, for coming in with your own expertise and threading together the conversations that we've had thus far. And I'm sure we'll be continuing them in some form or another in the future. Thank you for that. But that ends our webinar on Feeding the Future, a Shared Responsibility. I hope you enjoyed the conversations as much as I have. I'd like to thank our keynotes, President Michael D. Higgins and Mrs. Sabina Higgins, for their wonderful addresses at the beginning. And thank you to all of our contributors, Deborah Byrne, Laura McHugh, Professor Gerard Hastings, Meredith Kenosha, Orla O'Connor, and Dr. Liz O'Sullivan. And I see that Mrs. Sabina Higgins has actually been with us for the whole webinar, so thank you sincerely for joining us, and I'm sure that we'll be able to link in again and make sure we get this issue maintained on the agenda. Thank you sincerely. Thank you also to the National Women's Council and Baby Feeding Law Group Ireland for hosting the webinar for this National Breastfeeding Week. Let's keep the conversation in focus, talk about it to as many people as you can, highlight it to your public representatives. You may like to join the National Women's Council mailing list to keep up to date on this and other issues. There will be a recording of this webinar available on the website, and we will be sharing resources on breastfeeding as well, as part of the follow-up to this. So thank you everyone for listening in today. For the new moms who are listening, best of luck looking after your little ones, and I hope you found some support in how you are feeding your baby. Thank you all for your time today. Bye.